Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Leader and H2O's open house this year. This is the first session of lifting sap here in the conference room. I'm Nick Wendel. I am a dealer for Leader and for H2O before they were joined. They're both great companies. I picked them together myself because they complemented each other very well. And now they complement each other even better now that they're working together like we are. One of the neat things is that we're able to use fittings from both companies together now. And we're going to get into this lift design a little bit later. But I want to talk about specifically lifting sap. Now, one given thing is you need vacuum. I've got a lot of people ask me every now and again, is there any way I can lift sap without vacuum? Mechanically, you need a pump. You need some sort of a mechanical lift to do it without vacuum. We're going to be talking mainly today about lifting sap with vacuum. Couple of the things that go back to lifting sap with vacuum is what really lifts the sap effectively is air. So any good vacuum actuated lift, or however you want to figure it, is you're going to be letting a little bit of air in. The air is actually when the air wants to come up through the liquid to effectively push that sap up with the air. Without air, you're just capillary action trying to suck that sap up. You can do it, but you're going to get a more loss of vacuum, as in inches on the bottom side. The flip side of that is air coming in is a leak. So air coming in as a leak will also be a loss of vacuum. So we're going to try to control that. Lifting sap can be difficult in times because trying to get just the right amount of air for the sap flow that you have, you can get it tuned in perfect, and then the sap flow changes. And then the sap flow changes. The sap flow will change, every 10 minutes on a normal woods in a day, depending on how the sap's running. Trees are warming up, an ice jam breaks loose, a frozen line, whatever it might be. So coming up with something that is a little bit more self-regulating is a plus. Traditionally, you'll see a lot of lifts that are built similar to this. People call these spiders, star lifts, or whatever. This was a fashion that we've used for years, and I've used for years, and become amazingly frustrated with them sometimes. So what we have here, though, is, so this would be for 1-inch main line. This is a 1-inch base elbow coming down to a 4-way star. I've hooked up just 2 of them on just to show you guys. But you have a 5/16 line coming up. This is important that when you build these this way, your bottom elbow goes down so that you drain into your lift, obviously. But I've seen plenty of them built the other way. And then we're losing your 5/16 lines to come up to the top. Same thing with our top elbow. We're actually going to flip that so it drains back out of there. Okay? So this is a system that will work. We've seen these used a lot of places. There's actually an example of this in the woods between this facility and the tubing facility, where you can see something like this. What's frustrating on these, though, is you need quite a bit of air. And the reason that is that when you're moving sap in this direction, you're getting where the sap will get up about here, and then that air gets around the side of that 5/16, around your sap. The air goes into your main line down to the pump, sap goes back down. So we're trying to be conservative with how much air we're putting in the lines. We've just wasted that air. So now pump's got to make that air back up. It's basically a leak that was just wasted in our system. The other thing with a system like this is in excessive cases where you've got very fast movement of sap, we've seen where the sap comes right up, straight across, shoots right back down the other side. So we went through all the effort of lifting that sap straight up, and it's back down again.
Is there a limit on the height or something like that?
Yep, so whenever you're lifting sap, and this is for any case, the higher the vacuum level, the higher you can lift. So if you're running 15, 20 inches, 15 inches of vacuum, a 10 foot lift is going to be about your maximum that you can lift. If you're gonna run 25, 27, 28 inches of vacuum, you can effectively lift higher. But in any case, if you're going to try to lift more than 20 feet, I recommend doing it in steps. So basically you're gonna have a step where you lift, say 8 foot here, go back to a mainline situation, let that sap settle out, let it get smoothed back out, and then lift it up again. So you can lift higher, but anytime you do lift, you are losing some vacuum energy. You know, you're using your vacuum inches, if you will, of energy to lift that sap up. You could have 27 inches of vacuum at your pump. These lower lines are going to be, 22, 23. And it's going to variate too, depending on how effectively the lift is working, how the air is in the system, different values with that. But I have found with what I've ran over the years, when I was running a vacuum pump at 22 inches of vacuum and then switched over to a vacuum pump that run 26, 27 inches of vacuum, huge difference with how well and how effective the lifts were operating. The money I spent to upgrade that vacuum pump was the best thing that I ever did for that lift in that woods. So that's just an idea, is if you're considering lifting sap, higher the vacuum, the better. And also, again, keeping in mind that with effective lifts, we're letting air in. Air in is a leak. You've got to be able to overcome that too. So not to knock down any one pump or another, but something like a diaphragm pump, whether it be a SureFlow or a guzzler style, you're not always going to see super high vacuum, and you're not going to see a lot of CFMs. It's not my favorite pump to be lifting sap with out in the woods in this situation. A regular pump with a releaser and extractor is going to do a lot better. So over the years where I've had systems like this, got frustrated with them. You go down there at one point and everything's looking good vacuum on my lower line, sap flow changes, adjusts, doesn't work, this thing floods out. You spend, the next 2 hours down there fiddling, loosen up his tap, let a little air in, gets moving, and it just gets frustrating. We decided to try to come up with something different. And I've toyed around with sap lifting tanks, which are kind of like a releaser. Those work also, expensive. And especially if you're trying to lift, 50, 60 taps, it's not always advantageous to be spending a couple $1,000s on a sap lifter to make that work. 3/16 tubing came around, and I talked to a couple dealers that were starting to use 3/16 in their lifts. And so we thought about trying to come up with something for that. Now, anybody that's ever done that before, they were using an adapter. You cannot get a star fitting in 3/16. They were just putting a 5/16 to 3/16 adapter right here, running their lines up. Anybody knows with 3/16 it's a very common problem where you have fittings that are plugging. The fittings fit inside the 3/16, so obviously smaller ID, they'll plug up with anything and everything, and you're restricting your flow. And that was the biggest problem with these lifts. With the 3/16, is we were starting to get problems with plugging. Other 5/16 users that I had, we started using the H2O saddles just as a saddle. 3/16 tubing OD is almost the same as the ID of 5/16, so like basically 3/16 and the barb fittings are the same outer diameter. So we were just taking the 3/16 tubing and shoving it right inside the saddle without the elbows that normally go in there. I don't have one taken apart, but anybody that wants to come up and look at some point or at the end, H2O saddles are designed with a real heavy gasket. So you drill a hole, the gasket fits inside the hole, strap secures it, and then when you push the elbow fitting that normally comes with them into the gasket, it opens that gasket like a pop rivet, which seals it inside the line and on the surface of the line. So from that aspect, we'll switch over real quick to saddles. For a mechanically sealing saddle on the market, I don't think there's a better one on the market. The real heavy, aggressive gasket, it's not a cheap little thin gasket, it's gonna need to be replaced. I've had them to where, they get hit by a tree or a branch directly on that saddle, mangles them up, take the screw out, take it apart, put it back together, it's gonna seal back up just fine. Even if it got ripped half off the main line, it's still a reusable fitting in that aspect. So it's a very high quality fitting. They've worked great for us out in the woods. So with that in mind, wow, that tubing fits inside that saddle, maybe we can make a lift that way. And that's where this idea here was born. So basically we have, this is for 1-inch main line, you can use it for 3/4 or 1.25" also. We have H2O saddles that I've installed on my bottom of my line. This is 3/16 max flow tubing from Leader. It tends to have just a little bit heavier OD. We've had really good luck with it sealing in the saddles. On the bottom side here, we've cut the 3/16 tubing, on a 45-degree angle, and we shove it all the way down through the saddle till it hits the bottom of the pipe. I cut it on a 45 because I don't want to plug that line off on the inside of the main line. I want it still to breathe. But we cut that, shove it down in there. You may require a tool, like a two-hand tool quite often can help you push it in there because it is a tight fit. It's snug. You don't have to worry about it falling out. So on the bottom of our main line, this is the line that we're lifting. So that line goes all the way to the bottom, and that's going to facilitate the lifting of the sap straight up. We're using the same saddles and the same treatment on the very top also. Cut that line on a 45, shove it all the way up until it's at the top of that main line. So the biggest difference here now is first with 3/16 tubing, any air that we're letting in to help lift is not going to get around that sap like it does in the 5/16. So normally when we're lifting, sometimes that air can get around, the sap goes back down. We have very, very little, if none of that with the 3/16. The capillary size of the tubing and then the liquid gets a very solid lift, lifting that sap up. The other thing is because we're now lifting straight up, there's no curve. There's no radius here to go around. We don't have a chance for that air to be able to try to get on top of the sap in any way. Straight up, that's gonna go up. The other thing is that because of the way we went up inside the main line, when that sap comes out of the 3/16, it can't go back down. As long as this main line's not full of sap, that sap will not go back down that 3/16 line where it could possibly shoot over here and go back down the other side. So the main goal here is that if we're going to be lifting a little air into our lines to help lift the sap, we're not going to waste it. We're not going to be let that air go by and not do its job of lifting sap. And that's where these really come in, and these really, really work well. Excuse me. We've had very good luck with them. I've got dozens of them around Western New York where customers have put them in. And compared to the frustration of the other ones, we've had very, very good luck with these. Yes?
How far is the lift with that?
So you can lift, I'm still gonna recommend a maximum of 12, 15 feet as a single lift. Higher than that, still do the same thing where you step up in multiple steps. Sizing wise, I really haven't tested other than this, to be honest. About 15 taps per leg. So like this line would lift 60 taps approximately. We've had good luck with that. I cannot say I've done any research or testing as far as saying, what if we put an extra 5 on there, or what if we went smaller? Those are basically the same numbers that we've used for this style. So every left would be 15 taps approximately. We just stayed with those numbers and it's been effective. So don't mess with something that works in my mind.
How many lines do you need to put in for, so if I had 1.25" lines, I would put more of those?
Yes, yep. So say if you had, 150 taps that you were trying to lift, you would have 10 of these. Just run 10 straight up.
Okay.
So. The big, it's minute out in the woods in some cases, but, if you had, a couple 6-way stars all together, in order to get 12 legs, for instance, they do look nice, but they don't always look as pretty as you want them to, and you bundle them together. These do make for a very clean setup in the woods. You know, even if you've got main lines that are going different directions, everything looks nice and straight and clean out in the woods. Nobody's ever going to appreciate that more than a sugar maker, you know, because very few people are going to see it. But it does help for, you know, the sugar maker with OCD to be able to have it look nice. And we all like shiny stuff and clean in the sugar house. It might as well look good in the woods too, so.
Do those need some air in to make them work, or?
You're still gonna need a little bit of air, you know, but far less. What's that?
How do you let the air in?
Just, you can use, they don't seem to be nearly as available anymore, but the pulsating lifts, if you find one of them, those actually work, because they are more of a controlled leak. I actually recommend to people, you can get like an ice maker tap for a line, they'll call it. You can get them at Lowe's, your hardware store. It's a little needle valve that you can adjust that flow, very, very minute amount of air coming in. Most systems, you're gonna have enough micro leaks in an older system, especially, that it'd be fine without it. But if you do have a newer, tight system, just the smallest little micro leak is normally sufficient. When you're doing that, you're recommended that your leak be near the other end of this main line, which makes it very hard to run back and forth and check and to adjust that kind of stuff. But that's the right place to put it, because if this were to ever become flooded with sap, if you're just letting air in here, that air is just going up. You're not necessarily pushing that slug of sap down and effectively out. So at least, you know, 20, 30 feet up the main line is best. The other end of the main line is ideal. So, any questions pertaining to this exactly?
So, main line sizing, do you see anything different with that for taps? Could you change, or just what you think you would want main line size for that many taps is fine?
So mainline sizing for the amount of taps that you're lifting, I don't think we're going to change it too much. I like to oversize main lines most of the case anyways.
So it doesn't volume if you know.
The little bit of air that we are letting in, it doesn't need to be changed too much. So when you're changing, you know, I would size main lines for lifting the same as if we're normally doing anything. So, any other questions?
Vacuum loss, is that just on your lower line? Or
Yes,
is that-
so the question is about a loss of vacuum yes. So say for instance, this line here goes directly to your releaser. If everything is sized and length is correct here, this line will never have a change of vacuum. This lower line, you'll have a slight loss. Just any way that you're lifting sap, you're going to have a little bit of loss because you're using that energy to fight gravity at this point. So.
How much loss would you expect on a 15-foot lift like that?
It all depends. So how much vacuum loss on a 15-foot lift? A lot of it just depends on how much air you have coming in. And there's a very fine line there of you need enough air to lift the sap effectively. Without it, it's basically going to flood full. And then when you're trying to lift just liquid, no air behind it, you will effectively lose, I believe, it's somewhere around 1/2 inch per foot. So you could lose 7 or 8 inches in a 15-foot lift if you are simply using just sucking that water up directly with no air. With the right amount of air, you're keeping it moving where you're not lifting a column of liquid. You have air helping to push the liquid up. You can effectively only see 1 inch or 2 loss there. But if you have too much air that can't get through the pipe, then you have a leak type loss of vacuum. And that's where it gets very tricky sometimes. So we'll talk a little bit about another couple other methods that I've seen. One that's getting a little bit more traction, if you will, on a couple Facebook groups is a 2-pipe lift. I've tried these myself a little bit, and when I start talking about getting frustrated with this, you get very frustrated with a 2-pipe lift very quickly, because a 2-pipe lift is simply just on this line you would have 2 3/4 inch or even 1/2 inch lines going straight up. When you're trying to regulate they'll normally have a ball valve in one of them that you can adjust open and closed. On a small run, you close one. Big run, it might be open, halfway in between. You're adjusting it. If it's not easy to get to and easy to access, You're never going to adjust it, have it adjusted the right way. And again, flow changes so much, you're constantly adjusting that line. And it's very easy to get frustrated where, oh wow, the sap's really running. And you go down there and your bottom line's, at 6 inches of vacuum, and the only person to blame is you because you didn't turn the valve right. So they're a method that you can use to lift sap, but it is, they can be frustrating. So I'm not going to say you can't use them, but they can be aggravating. Something else that we're in some cases recommending to people is what I'm going to call like a transverse slope on your 5/16 lines. So no different than we're looking at a slight loss when we're lifting sap with the 3/16 or a 5/16 lift. Depending on how your woods lays, if you've got a situation where, side hill, vacuum releaser sits here and you run your main lines on a slope. We want our main lines to have slopes so they drain. So our main line comes up. You've got this corner little pocket here that you can't reach. You've got two options to lift that sap. You can run another main line down below, lift that main line up into the next main line on the hill. If you have trees that are just below your main line, just run the 5/16 uphill. It goes against what we've learned, I understand that. But when you're looking at the loss of lifting sap with vacuum, we're lifting sap with vacuum. If you just run your 5/16 lines uphill to your main line, you're lifting sap with vacuum. If you've lost a couple inches here, you're going to lose a couple inches there. The biggest difference is if this main line were to flood, now every tap on that line is affected by that flood. As far as the main line being full of sap, the main line's not breathing correctly, you've affected the whole main line. If you've got a situation where one or two of them taps is acting weird in that line, it's just that 5/16 line. So we've had good luck with that. Again, it's a loss. It's a handicap on those taps. But what's the option? You're not going to tap them? Or, I've had people, if you have a big enough system where, okay, there's 500 taps down here, I don't want to struggle with lifting sap, 500 taps is worth putting an electric extractor in if you've got power available to you and lifting it to your tank. That's an option to lift sap, but that's a lot of taps. You have to have power available, where you're not going to struggle with the loss of vacuum in any which way. And that actually is going to lead to a segue into, if you will, another option where people are, we're seeing a lot in the industry now. You get an older woods, been tapped for a long time, been tapping the same woods for 4, 5, 6 generations. You're running out of good wood above your lateral line. Tapping below the lateral line, same thing, same idea. We're tapping below that line. Where the research comes in on that is if you're tapping old affected wood, where you've got compartmentalized wood, and you happen to get into a compartmentalized space or close to that, you're going to get 10% less, 20% less, 50% less, 80% less sap. You tap below the lateral line, tests have shown that you're looking at a loss of 3 to 5% because you're lifting that, you have that column of sap that you're lifting. So tap below the lateral line, you're going to lose a few percent of your production. But if you tap the wrong spot up above, you may be losing 50 or 80%. So tapping below the lateral line is the same thing. We're lifting sap with vacuum. But just recommendations if you're doing that is where you come, your spout comes out of the tree. We do recommend that you do loop downward just a little bit before you go up to your your tee. That way you don't always have sap that's just settling right at your spout. Downfalls to stuff like this, when we're lifting in this, any sap lines anything that we're lifting, this taps below the lateral line, transverse slope 5/16, or any lift. If lifts freeze up, you're gonna have liquid in lines, they're going to freeze. And you get a big hard freeze, warms up a little bit, tomorrow, sunshine for, that whole whopping hour, the lines fill up with sap and it freezes back up again. Look to those first as your leakers. That's always gonna be where you're gonna have lines pushed apart, taps pushed out of trees. Save yourself the aggravation, go look there first. It's just a common side effect problem of lifting sap. You know, it's just one thing we've had. One other recommendation, if you do start tapping below your lateral lines, one of the most aggravating things you're gonna have is when you go start looking for leaks. So I had a woods where one of my new guys tapping has done that before. He had a couple smaller trees. He did tap below the lateral line in my woods. We've never really done it before. When I'm out looking for leaks, you know, you're walking, you're looking, and all of a sudden, oh, I can see that drop line over there is hanging down below lateral. I bet that one pushed out of the tree. No, it was tapped, but it looked like it was hanging down below the lateral line because that's where it was tapped. So just keep those things in mind. It can be aggravating looking for leaks, thinking, oh, there's my leak, and it's not your leak. But
Nick, with tap below the lateral line, would you recommend a check valve adapter? Because you're going to constantly have water, liquid in that.
so if yes, anywhere that you're lifting sap, I recommend check valves personally myself throughout the entire woods. But anything where you are lifting sap, check valves are a great recommendation on those lines. Because you are seeing vacuum that may not be a regular constant. You're gonna see vacuum that's up and down, your levels change. And also things like when they're freezing up and stuff like that. A check valve will help, check valve spouts will help with the systems there. So, any other questions?
The transverse slope on the 5/16, how high do you recommend going with that?
Transverse slope with the 5/16 height-wise, I guess I can't make a great recommendation because we haven't tested more or less. I would recommend it's less about height, more about just length, distance. So we try to keep our 5/16 lines 100 feet or less in length. Whatever you're going up in 100 foot of length, if you will, would be my max. I mean, I'm thinking to myself just where I've used that, you know, 12, 15 foot worth of lift. But it's a little easier to manage when that 5/16 line is just walking along. You know, you're going up that high, you're not climbing on the ladder to try to do it. And that's where those systems are a little bit easier to install sometimes also because of that. You're not on ladders out in the woods without good footing. You know, we've all leaned a step ladder, an extension ladder up against the main line and, you know, it's bouncing and moving around and, you know. Good thing there's no OSHA in the woods. So, any other questions pertaining to any of that kind of stuff? Just some basics that we're going to get back to. I mean, I've had customers come into my place all the time, and I went to visit one in the woods, or visit a woods. He was not getting the production he thought he needed. He had gravity tubing for years, put vacuum on it. And that's one thing that when we design a system for a customer now, we build it for vacuum. Regardless whether he wants to put vacuum on it, we design it for vacuum because at some point they'll end up there. And this was a system that was never designed for vacuum, and I knew it needed changes. Got to the woods and it was very, very realized. So he had put a mechanical releaser on top of his tank, and his main lines that used to come in right at the top of the tank, he just ran them up into the releaser. So he was lifting sap with his main line. He was not getting great vacuum transfer out to the woods. Anytime you're moving sap in the woods, on a main line especially, slope is important. You know, try to keep a 2 to 6% slope on your main lines to keep everything flowing downhill. Any more than 6, you can get a turbulence issue, and that's where something like a wet dry line will help influence that, improve that kind of turbulence issues. 5/16 lines, if you have slope available, put slope on them too. Unless of case we're talking like the transverse slope where we're going uphill with them. Obviously, we don't have slope in that case. But if you have a slope, if you are slope challenged, keep the slope on your main lines. You know, that's the important place to have the slope is on your main lines. Slope on 5/16, we can fight that and it'll still work if we don't have it. But making sure your main lines drain into your releaser, your extractor, whatever you're using for your vacuum source, that's important. So, talk about CFMs just a little bit. I personally, CFMs in a vacuum system, we're talking about recovering the CFMs that we're using in a leak type state where we're lifting sap. I like to see, especially if you're lifting sap, somewhere around 2 CFM per 100 taps. That's my personal. A lot of the industry looks at it for about 1 CFM per 100 taps. If you keep a tight system, you're always out there working, you can get away with 1 CFM per 100. If you're like me and you have an equipment store that's open from 9 to 5 every day and you're not always able to get out in the woods and find them leaks, I like to have a little bit of buffer room there. So for me, 2 CFM is good. It also gives you a little bit more leeway to have a leak to make your lift work the way it should and not be affecting the entire system. With CFMs in mind, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between electric extractors and mechanical releasers. Both of them are doing the same thing. They're facilitating the removal of sap out of our system without it going through the vacuum pump. A mechanical releaser, though, there's examples right out in the showroom right now that are operating. For them to operate, when that canister fills up, it has to release the vacuum inside that canister for the sap to come out. When it does that, it re-vacuumizes the opposite canister. So that's full of air. You're sucking that air out of the system, okay? It's basically a leak, if you will. We're recovering that air every time we do that. When we compare that to an electric extractor, it's the opposite. So now when on an electric extractor, you fill your canister up, when you pump that canister down, we're actually creating more CFMs of vacuum. So if you ever have a situation of where, boy, I think a little bit bigger vacuum pump would be better, sometimes you can switch your releaser for an extractor and actually gain back them CFMs you're losing every time the releaser cycles. You're also gonna see far more consistent vacuum levels. If you have leaks in a system, a lot of times you'll see your vacuum drop every time it dumps. That's because there's so much air coming in that it's actually not, the pump's not keeping up, while it's also sucking the air out of your releaser. So things to take into effect. Electric extractors obviously need electric. They also should be in a heated place to be ideal. Keep the pumps from freezing and stuff like that. So there's limitations, obviously, and there's not everybody can have electric extractors, but we've been very happy where we've upgraded them in our system, and I'm going to continue to keep adding them everywhere I can because they're far more reliable. So, but they need electricity, so when the power goes out, they don't work very well. So.
Well, what happens if the power does go out? Where does that?
So the way I've designed mine so far, excuse me, I've designed mine so coming my vacuum line coming out of my electric extractor, I'm lucky enough to have tanks that are fairly close. So my vacuum line coming out of my extractor where it goes to my moisture trap, I have put higher than my tanks. So as the system, so we have no power, the extractor fills up with sap. Sap's running, gonna fill up with sap. Rather than letting it fill and just run into the vacuum pump, there's a T and an old style check valve flap that goes into my tank. So as the system just fills up with sap and it gets to the height of the tank, it goes into the tank. So again, I have tanks that are close by that are not super height difference, but that's where I'm able to combat that. So
If you lose electricity, that's gonna go up, and
it's just gonna flow gravity into the tank, but you have to give it a route to get into the tank.
is there a certain distance you would go, or
As far as
is up and before it hits your
just
humidity trap?
as far as how high I have to go, just as long as it gets in the top of the tank. That's the important thing. As long as that sap can get in the top of the tank, that's as far as I need to go. So,
I take it your extractor sits on the floor?
yes, my extractor sits on the floor. I like personally to keep mine up a little bit. Makes it easier to clean. If I do just a wooden pallet or something sometimes underneath them, makes it easier to see in, get in there, clean them. If you do have a height issue where you're challenged for height, sometimes you can't always do that. You gotta put them as low as possible. But my woods, luckily enough, have not been that way. So, but In my case, I always recommend electric vacuum pumps for normally the same. They're more reliable as far as when they're running. You don't have to worry about them running out of gas. Again, when power goes out, though, that does get interesting very quickly. So, but any other questions?
Nick, have you found any of 316's tubing that doesn't work well on the ladder?
As far as different types of tubing, I can't say I've tested anything other. My first one that I built with Leader's 30P 316, which is no longer available. That worked. It actually went into the fittings easier. In an extreme case of like over a long summer with a lot of wind, we did actually have some of that come out of the saddles, but we put them back in. They lasted the whole season fine. I will say with the Leader 316, the Max Flow 50 that we've got in there now, that stays in there. I have never had it come out, but I haven't tested other brands either, so I can't say for sure. So.
Is that a fairly rigid 316?
I would say it's a halfway in between. It's not as rigid as 30P was. But it's not a super flexible tubing. So. All right.
What do you want for your height difference from, like on your bottom main line? Do you want it really sloping down at that ladder?
No, fairly level. I mean, obviously you want things to drain out as always. But say for instance, I were to have a drain valve here on the bottom of my main line. So this is running up to my woods. This isn't gonna make any, you're gonna flood this end. Keep it fairly level so each of these can work together, but just enough slope that it will still drain out. And same thing on the top. I mean, don't lift any higher than you have to. So obviously your line here that's running back to your releaser, extractor, whatever, you don't wanna make it, just because you make it real steep, it's going to add a couple more feet, but you still do want it to drain. We don't want this to flood full of sap, so make sure it does have slope to drain out. So, anybody else? Sorry I didn't talk for the entire hour, but Any other questions on vacuum in general, I'd be happy to try to answer.
Essentially, you're saying to use your lift method rather than a double, like a 5 or 6 star method,
Yes.
because because of the curvature of the tubing between the stars, you're losing.
Yes, the air, sometimes you're losing that air and it's not lifting the sap. And again, that's just an ineffective leak at that point. Leaks can be used effectively with the right method, and to lift sap, we need those leaks. So,
Those saddles are here?
I'm sorry?
You have those saddles here?
Yes. Yep. So when you buy the saddles, they're going to come with the 90-degree elbow. In this case, you're not using those elbows. So.
Being you're lifting and making vacuum in that tube, do they tend to freeze first, the 316?
I think freezing, as far as a lift freezing first, a lot of that's still going to come back to the air situation. We know we need air for these to lift, and quite often any air coming in is going to be your source of a freeze. So effectively, yes.
Pinhole and it'll freeze right there.
Yes.
That's what I was wondering about that.
Yep. So unfortunately, this is a case of, lifting sap is not ideal in any case, and we're going to have freezing issues. Even without the air influencing the freezing, it's going to freeze. There's going to be liquid here that's going to fill up, and it's going to be a problem. But it also comes down to, we're just going to leave them taps. It's not normally the sugar maker's mantra of, we're not going to leave any taps behind anywhere. If there's trees, we're going to tap them. Just lifting sap, we know we're not going to see that. You may have a woods that gives you 25 gallons of sap per tap. I know them lift lines didn't. It's just the way it's going to be. But if the whole woods gave me 25 and those gave me 18, I'll still take that 18. Just understand that, there's certain points you're going to be frustrated with a lift, and they're not going to perform ever as much. But a little bit's better than none.
You ever tried to run an airline down to the
Yes.
lower one?
Yep, so what the question here is an airline running down to lower. And I get that quite often, and I'm sorry I didn't comment on that before. So basically what, in this case, this main line would be continuing up to our taps. Quite often they'll just take this, you're acting as a dry line, run your dry line down, tee it in. The problem with that system, it makes sense. Think, oh man, now I got perfect vacuum down on the bottom. There's no reason for that sap to want to try to go up our lines through our lift, because now the air is just going to go up the dry line, and until the whole system floods and shuts that line off, nothing's going to happen. And even at that point, it's going to try to suck that air up, because that 1-inch line is going to be a far easier path than our 3/16. So they're just going to try to suck it up that main line. Try to suck it up that main line. And when you talk about wasted air, you have a lot of wasted air trying to suck it up that 1-inch main line going into your dry line. Or is it call it a dry line? So it basically makes them ineffective. The idea of vacuum transfer is great, but it's not going to effectively be a lift anymore.
Just put more tubing lines in to try to get more air down there.
Hypothetically, and that's something I haven't tested with this. I know with this method, it was with poor results. Only because, for whatever reason, when you oversize these, so say we 15 taps average per lift. So say I have 150, so I need 10 legs to lift that. I'll put 3 4-way stars or 3 6-way stars. That's 18 of them. That'd double. That should work better. I've never seen one that was oversized work nearly as good as one that was around that 15 taps. Now, with the 3/16, because we don't have that bypass ability, it might actually do it. I haven't tested it though, to be sure. To be able to get more air down there.
Because if those are solid with sap, then if you don't have enough of them, they're all going to be full of sap with no air.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the air get down there?
Until you get all that sap, until you get that sap moved out of the way, exactly.
But they're never empty. We've got some at home. They're never totally empty. They're always full at the bottom all the time.
Yep, and so if you've got a star lift like this where you're constantly seeing sap just in every line sitting full, that's a situation of just not enough air. You need a little bit more air in that system letting in to help to lift that sap up. And that's where they get frustrating sometimes to go. He brought up a very important point that I missed when we start talking about wet and dry lines. So this is an extreme case. Quite often when we're lifting sap, it is not an issue of distance. But in some cases we do have where we have a wet dry line coming up to this point, and because of length from this lift going out, we maybe want a wet dry line after also. The common thought is we're just going to run a dry line basically over top and just run it down. It will not work. Same issue of just trying to tee that line down in there. If the easier path is the dry line, that's where the air is going to go, that's where the sap's going to go until it just floods itself. So if we had that rare case where we have a wet dry line coming from here down, we would basically just Y them together. And then same thing here, where this continues out farther. If we want to continue that dry line because of distance, because of length, and this is 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet plus type of length that we're trying to carry that vacuum, we would just Y our dry line back out and continue it on. The air and the sap all has to go through the lift to be effective. It's an extreme case that you're not going to see very often, because if you're lifting, you're not normally lifting that much sap that distance where you need a wet dry line, but that is effective. And we have seen in a couple cases where you are needing a lot of air with a system like this to make the lift work, where just simply a dry line from here to the releaser can be effective. Just a little extra air recovery would help. So.
How far should you keep your dry line from your manifold? Like where you're widening it in?
Just close as possible.
Close as possible.
Yeah, bring Y or manifold your dry line and your wet line together as closely as possible. You know, as close to here as possible. You want to get that air out and down the line as quickly as. So. Good question, by the way. Thank you. I forgot all about that part. So it was in my notes that I forgot to bring with me. So. Question? No, just for a second. All right. Well, if there's any other questions on vacuum in general, I'd be happy to try to answer them. You know, any other ideas on misusing fittings? I'd be happy to try to help. So, but that was the running joke when we started with this was, you know, well, what do we got here? And this is you know, using fittings incorrectly. You know, this was never meant to be a lift saddle. This was meant to be, you know, a saddle on a mainline entrance, if you will. And we've had very good luck with them again in general. As a fitting, they seal very well.
You could probably use any saddle, couldn't you?
Not necessarily. And I have seen in some cases where, so for instance, we'll use Leader's Quick Seal saddle as an option. That has a 90-degree bend that's grooved right in there. For you to use that saddle on the bottom, you would have to, you know, install it upside down, which is possible, and then you're back into the curve. And you'd have to put it on the top also. So you have your curve again. Potentially, it'll work. But you're still into the radius problem that you have here. I'll use an example also of, for instance, CDL's spin seal. You're going to have to install it on the bottom and have a big, even more of a loop than that to make this work. This is the only saddle that I know of where you can take the normal attachment, the barbed attachment, not use it to where we can go straight down inside there. And again, you guys are all more than welcome to come up and look right down here in the end. You can see how that 3/16 tubing will go right to the bottom of the main line. And the same thing up here on the top, where it's actually going straight up into the main line all the way to the opposite wall to where it can't flow back down.
Go all the way to the bottom?
It's in order to suck as much out as you can, yes. And that's where the 45-degree cut that's on the 3/16 is good. If you had a straight cut, jammed it all the way down to the bottom, you're almost going to seal it off. And that's not effective either. So
Orientation of the 45?
I don't think it makes a difference. No, I don't think it makes a difference. The one thing that I would recommend if you were installing a lot of them is sometimes you're going to struggle. This one wasn't so bad because I could see in there. If you're installing it on a main line, you're not going to be able to see inside. So getting some sort of a measurement with a mark here on a marker on your 3/16 so you know you're in far enough would be a good recommendation when you're doing that install. So, you know, it's going to be approximately 1.25 inches, say, to make sure that you are far enough in without being too shallow.
You definitely think the 3/16 is the way to go, not the 5/16.
From using it, we're so happy with the 3/16 as a lift, I would say so, yes. Potentially 5/16 would be more flow and everything else. So it might be a more advantageous option. The one problem is I can't fit a 5/16 in here to make it work the way it should, to test it. With the right fittings, I could possibly, I've been thinking about it, trying it just to say, hey, we tried this with 5/16 and it doesn't work nearly as good. Because we're back to a situation where sap and air can separate and our air can go back up. Even in a vertical, perfectly straight state, we get too much lost air. I honestly haven't tried it. But with 3/16, we've had very good luck with it, you know. And I mean, that's the idea of the 3/16. So in a gravity vacuum situation, we have a column of liquid that will not let the air by it, and it's pulling down. We're using that size in our advantage here, where we're not letting the air by it. And we're using it to lift the sap.
Do you think going straight up is definitely better than going at an angle?
Yes. Yep.
I've heard it both ways.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard some people like it laying down more.
Like
No.
one of these kind of deals?
No, like you got one main line here and one main line here. They got them going this way.
I think straight up is, with 3/16, I don't think it's as important.
Linear saddle to the bottom, across the top.
Yeah. Yeah, with 3/16, I don't know if it's as important, but I think vertical is far better, especially for the fact of, I mean, if you're, and you should be, if you're viewing this area as a restriction, we should be trying to keep it as short as possible. If you're angling, now it's longer. You've lengthened your restriction out. So there's always going to be, exceptions where, the tree that I anchored to here and that you maybe have an issue like that, but if you anchor to this tree and this tree, even if you got to cross the tree, I would be okay, but trying to keep it as vertical as possible. So.
Have you ever tried just using a diaphragm pump?
I have actually. I did that once. I use it using a diaphragm pump to lift sap. I used a Bosworth guzzler, a single diaphragm. I thought, man, this is perfect. I've got vacuum coming. There's vacuum on both sides. It should not. Why would it? It shouldn't even work that hard. It works quite hard. It will effectively work. The biggest thing is because now we've pulled. In my case, it was 27 inches. It was quite hard on diaphragms. Normally a diaphragm, when you're pumping, you're in a situation where you're sucking 20 plus inches, but then you're pushing, and then you're sucking, and then you're pushing. In my case, it was always sucking against 27 inches because that air was pushing against the opposite side of the diaphragm. It was always just really working hard on that diaphragm. Did it work? Yes. Did I struggle with freezing? Excessively. I still had issues with that. And what I tried in that case is I had a dry line still coming down. So I had amazing vacuum. I was mechanically lifting sap in the wet line, so I thought it should be fine, but we still struggled a lot with freezing on that pump. I would have thought it was the best way, but it didn't work nearly as good as I hoped it would. So I far prefer this method. And cost-wise, too, versus a diaphragm pump, this is far cheaper. So, yes, sir.
You might want to mention the bugs. You should check your air daily.
Say that again?
The air you're injecting into that.
Yep.
Just a little bit.
Yep.
It doesn't take much of a bug to fill that hole up.
Absolutely. So if you do have an engineered leak, his comment was about bugs. I don't know what it is about them little gnats. It's the easiest way to find a squirrel chew when you're out in the woods is, why is there 6 bugs stuck in one spot on my 5/16 line? There's a chew mark underneath it. For whatever reason, they follow it. I don't know if it's a noise or whatever. But yes, if you do have an engineered leak in your line, say it's a needle valve of some sort to let some air in to let your lift work better, filter, guard that some way, shape, or form. Whether it be a piece of fabric over the end of the valve or something like that, where a little bug can't get in there and plug it. If you have just a valve, they could even get in that valve where you can't see them in there. So something to think about too is filtering that slightly.
So you got valves on the end of yours then?
Yes.
Little valves?
Yep. I like personally valves on the end of all my main lines, 1-inch valves, all my main lines. We like to flush them out at the end of the season with some water or some cleaning solution, depending on what I'd like to do. So a lot of times what I'll do is I've got a 1-inch valve already. I just thread a bushing in there with my little valve.
Oh, yeah.
Open the big valve up. It's easy to take out if it gets plugged up or something like that. I can easily unthread it, take it home, adjust it, whatever I need to do.
I've done that, but I found that I get leaks in the ball valve.
Cheap valves will be a problem with that, yes.
Gotta put a cap on it.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
sometimes. So, yep, that's certainly, when you start looking at a big woods and I need 150 ball valves in this entire woods to put valves on the end of every end of a main line, you decide you want to be cheap on ball valves. You get what you pay for. So, one thing I guess I would also, just on that, we talked about flushing out main lines and stuff like that. As with any lines, plugging might be an issue on some of these. So being able to clean them lines is certainly something that would help to keep plugging at a bay, even just flushing the main lines out. So in this case, I would normally put a ball valve at the bottom where I can open that up to let things drain out. Your first run kind of stuff. You may not have vacuum up on top of this at the moment, but opening a valve here to let the crud and stuff flush out and not plug these up. So I wash my tubing. I know I'm a minority in the world, but I still wash my tubing. It's just, for us, it's something that we've always done. I've sat in seminars. I've sat on tubing panels before where I was the only one washing in the entire room. But me personally, it's more about quality over quantity. Nothing against anybody that doesn't want to wash. The research shows it's not worth it. But myself, when I see my first run of saps crystal clear, that second run of sap after that hard freeze is crystal clear. I'm not plugging up pumps and extractors and lifts and everything else. That's what makes it worth it for me.
How do you clean them?
So we're using, it's a product called hydroxysand from Hydrite chemical company. I sell it. It's hard to ship. I'm in Western New York if anybody would like some of the stuff, but it does make it difficult to ship it. It's a hydrogen peroxide based cleaner. And so we wash with vacuum. So any instance in the woods, we suck a little bit down each main line first just to clean any crud out. And then all my guys that are pulling taps, we use a 4-gallon backpack sprayer. We don't normally fill them full depending on how steep the hill is, just because it can get heavy. But 2 or 3 gallons in a backpack sprayer. I've gutted all the pumps out. Basically, it's a tank and straps. I'm not too proud to tell you that I buy them at Harbor Freight. Last week, they were on sale for $19.99. They're a nice tank with nice straps. We've got the pump and everything off them, get rid of that weight. Just a hose sticking in the top. I pull my tap out, suck a little bit of that hydroxysand cleaner down the line, cap it off. I will not recommend anybody to use chlorine unless they are your worst enemy. Chlorine needs a 30-minute contact time to be effective. You're not leaving residue in the lines that long. You're going to get a residue of salt that the squirrels love. So that's why you recommend it for your enemies. We used it for years because it is an effective cleaner. 52 weeks a year, I supervise a poultry plant, USDA inspected poultry plant. Sanitation is what I know. Chlorine is an amazing sanitizer, just not in the woods. Hydrogen peroxide is equally effective. It needs a 30-second contact time depending on how strong you're using it. And when it comes to residue situation, there is no residue. So when you dilute your hydrogen peroxide down, it starts an aging process on that product. Hydrogen peroxide is H2O2, so 2 hydrogens, 2 oxygen atoms. When it breaks down, it turns into pure water and free oxygen. Nothing wrong with that in our lines. That's what's in there most of the time anyways. I am using permeate when I dilute that down. So technically there's nothing foreign. I had a discussion with a guy once that, why would you put well water or creek water or spring water or whatever in your lines? There might be, God knows what's in there, whether it be minerals, whether it be, algae type stuff, And I took that to heart, and we use permeate now out of the RO machine to dilute down the hydrogen peroxide. So basically it's sap that came out of the lines, we're putting it back in. Start at the top of the 5/16 when we're rinsing, we work toward the main line. Always work toward the main line. When we're all done, we flush another pail down the main line again. We've got to pull the taps out of the trees anyways. Takes a little bit longer to wash that way, but we've had very, very good luck with it. Personally, I know a lot of people like the pool shock. I've never used that myself. The powdery residue that I've heard about scares me a little bit on that stuff as far as just a residue in the lines. I know there's no residue with the hydrogen peroxide. So, only caution with the hydrogen peroxide type cleaners is quite often in its fully concentrated state, it's dangerous. It'll leave a chemical burn on your hand. The dilution that we're using it, not a problem at all. dilute it down, it's perfectly fine. But in its full concentrated strength, use caution, as with any chemical, for that fact. But
What's your dilution ratio?
the product that we have, the hydroxysan, is about 1 ounce of the concentrated product to 6 gallons of water. So very little. 16 ounces to 100 gallons is,
Cleans the lines.
yep. So, yep, and we've been very happy with it. I've got a customer that's been using it actually before I started selling it. He's got some underground lines that he has struggled with bacteria buildup. You know, a normal main line out in the woods, you get a hot sunny day in July, August, it's 105 degrees outside. It's 120 degrees inside that main line. That kills bacteria. You get a cold day, 10 below zero in the woods. A main line is 10 below zero. That's slowing down bacteria. That's even killing some. Underground, main line never freezes. That's great, right? Not out in the sun, not heating sap up, always 55. That main line is always 55 degrees. The bacteria does not stop growing, ever. So he's been cleaning mainly his underground lines with hydroxysan 3 times a year, actually. And the reason he's doing it 3 times a year is these lines are been in the ground for 15 or 20 years. There's layers that build up. He's removing them 1 layer at a time. That's just the way that it removes is 1 layer at a time. And he's seen a drastic improvement in quality of the sap. So, and especially like invert sugars and stuff. So, but you guys have all been a great group. Thank you, I appreciate it. I'd take more questions afterwards, but we got another group that's getting started in. More than welcome to find me around. Look for the Blaze Orange hat. I'll be around somewhere.